Hello, everybody. This is the first lecture for our first class on October 9th. So I'm just going to go through the questions a little bit, give some brief answers, and then you all can supplement when it's class time based on what you find in the readings. So I'll give you some brief overview, and I'll just go briefly through the questions in these YouTube lectures. And I'll try to post them earlier from now on. Sorry, this one's a bit late. So the first question is, what does mission mean? And what is mission significance for Christians? And then what does this kind of rock opera, Jesus Christ Superstar, tell us about Christianity? What kind of lessons does it give? So the word mission is very simple. It actually just means to send something. Missive is a kind of fancy word for letter. Mission is just a sending. And a missionary is someone who's sent somewhere. And what's its significance? It's basically mission is commanded by Jesus. Jesus tells his first disciples in the Bible to go and to spread his message, to talk to people. And this is the main way that Christianity has spread. Now, what mission looks like is something you can develop from the reading. Our concept of mission is often a little bit strange, but it's actually a very common process. And the way Robert describes it, I think most of us who have any exposure to Christians can see that there is some mission going on kind of all the time. And then this story that Robert talks about, this author, Dana Robert, she mentions Jesus Christ Superstar because it shows the kind of adaptability, the diversity of the Christian message. Jesus was born in the rock opera. They make this point. Why were you born in such a faraway, backward place? Well, even though it was a faraway, backward place in a way, it can be updated, continuously updated, so that it appeals to young people in all kinds of generations. The people in the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union, saw Jesus Christ Superstar as really transgressive, really rebellious, because they had state-sponsored atheism, and this was both rock music, blue jeans, and religion, all the kind of things that they weren't supposed to be getting into. So you can see how it can be repackaged and moved all around the world. The second question has to do with this timeline of the spread of Christianity. Where was it in the 3rd, 7th, 16th, 20th centuries? And then does Christianity spread just continually, or is there another kind of story we can talk about? So in the 3rd century, Christians are already in Europe, Asia, and Africa because of the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire basically spans the Mediterranean and those 3 continents. However, by the 7th century, it's moving north into northern Europe. And then by the 16th century, it has spread because of the age of exploration. It's spread throughout the Americas and further into Asia. And then by the 20th century, it's even more global. It's just continued to spread, mainly by natives themselves, as we'll see in these books and in our class today. But it is more global than ever. There are Christians, indigenous leaders, that is people from those countries, not foreign missionaries, not foreign leaders, but people, for instance, Zimbabweans leading Zimbabwean Christianity in Zimbabwe. So now it might sound like, or it might seem like when we tell this story, that this is just a story of continual progress, but actually the story of Christianity is cyclical. There's advances and then retreats. It kind of goes forward and backward. It's a much more up and down kind of process moving forward. And it never seems sure, never seems guaranteed. In fact, Christianity almost seems like it's going to get wiped out, just as it might be spreading somewhere else. The place with its strength might get wiped out. And that's something we can talk about more from the book also. The third question is to ask you to describe the missionary nature of early Christianity, and why does it make sense to think about Paul as a missionary? Well, there were a lot of things in Rome, the Roman Empire, that allowed for missions to spread, and we see that the message did spread, that the Christians did spread their message. They took Jesus' words seriously, and they tried to convert others. And Paul, he's often called the first missionary or the top missionary, but he's not really. He's just a missionary. Even his letters show that there are others before him, before he starts, but it is appropriate to consider him a missionary. Because of his travels, because he travels so much, because he writes so much, and because he's so early in the tradition, he really has a huge impact. And probably fittingly, he's often called Paul the Apostle. An apostle is just Greek for the same word as the Latin missionary. So it's actually the same thing, Paul the missionary. Literally, Paul the Apostle is literally to say Paul the mission. And when you say Peter the Apostle, or the Pope is the apostle, it's the same root. It just means to send in Greek, as missio does in Latin. So we have a lot of sending, sent people, sent ones. Now, the fourth question is, how does mission characterize the early church? How did mission characterize Christians in the 4th and 5th centuries? And then what about the political change in Rome? What does that mean for non-Romans? So in the early church, the Christians are on the move, partly because of persecution, partly because of natural travel, and partly because of Jesus's commands, or because this missionary nature of the Christian religion. And it's spreading, especially the main boundaries, it's spreading through the Jewish Gentile boundary. Jewish religion, especially at that time, by those who kept it seriously, kept Jews from even eating with non-Jews often, much less marrying with them or spreading their religion. Judaism was not a conversionary religion. And so there were people who were interested in Judaism, but they were not encouraged to convert, and in fact, there would have been a pretty significant barrier to conversion. They weren't welcome, A, and B, if they were male, they would have to be circumcised, which is a very painful process. It's a cutting of the foreskin of the penis. It's extremely painful for an adult male. Usually it's practiced on babies within the Jewish culture, but you wouldn't want to convert. Many men would not want to convert, and even there would be social effects. If you did convert, you might not be able to eat with your family unless they converted. So this big boundary was crossed in the early Christian world when these first Christians started welcoming Gentiles to become part of this, believe in this Jewish Messiah, be part of this, what was originally an overwhelmingly Jewish community, and to worship, read the scriptures of Israel, and consider themselves part of the same community without circumcision, and sometimes without holding to these same rules of eating, allowing them to mingle freely with Gentiles. So by the 4th and 5th centuries, and they were persecuted. This is another part of this story. Now, by the 4th and 5th centuries, they're no longer being persecuted so much, and their languages are set. They've translated, they have Bibles translated into all these languages, and they're really kind of hardened by their persecution. In a way, they're kind of battle tested, you could say. They know what they believe in. They've seen people die for the faith, be tortured for the faith, and continue to believe. And so these Christians are pretty difficult at this point to stamp out. They just keep growing. The numbers keep growing. They might be about 10% or more of the population, and hard to wipe out entirely then. And then that's when this big change happens, which is that Christianity becomes tolerated. Instead of being persecuted, instead of Christians being attacked, they get accepted and then even welcomed, promoted by the people who are in power in the Roman Empire. And so by the 4th and 5th century, the 4th century is when this happens. That's the 300s. And so by the 4th and 5th centuries, you have a very big change happening in Christianity. And even though this seems good for Christians in Rome, which it probably is overall, it's bad for Christians in the Persian Empire, which is Rome's old enemy, Rome's old rival. And so they have persecution there. That's part of the story as well. And then in the 5th question, we see, what is the Christianization of Europe? What does it mean for the spread of the church? How did popes and bishops contribute? How were monks and ascetics involved? And then what's the role of monks and monarchs? I asked you in the question for kings and monarchs, but I'd like you, if you can, to talk a little bit about the monks instead of just kings. And it's okay if you don't. I will help supplement it. But basically, the Christianization of Europe means that the faith is moving northward. This is one of the big moves we see about the 7th century, so the 600s. As the Roman Empire collapses, again, it seems like Christianity is losing its heartland, that there will be no more Christians. They were the imperial religion for a couple hundred years, but then they're kind of falling apart, falling away. Their political power of Rome is completely crumbling. But it turns out that the barbarians who are coming to take its place, they become Christians in a kind of surprise. And so this moves the faith pretty radically northward, towards the Germanic peoples, towards what is today Northern Europe, and the people who live there now. And part of this process is helped along by popes and bishops. The Pope offers kind of at least a symbolic source of authority. When the Roman Empire is falling apart, when there's no longer kind of a unified whole and the whole world is fragmenting, decentralizing, well, there's at least a symbol of the Pope that promises for the unity of all the people who call themselves Christians, all these Europeans. And then there's also these local bishops who actually holds power. So the Pope is far away, but these local bishops are often very capable. They may be literate usually and competent administrators with elite ties with other bishops, with other governors or local rulers. And the bishops end up taking a very powerful role in Christianizing their local areas, the bishops wherever they are, usually in these major cities. And so then we have these monks and ascetics and kings and monarchs. And the monks really are maintaining the literacy, maintaining technology. Often they're the only ones. Sometimes they're the only ones that can read and write in this area. And they even maintain pagan stories. We wouldn't have Beowulf, like some of our earliest English literature, if it isn't for the monks. And so, they can, because they can write, they can do legal codes, they can do accounting, things like that for kingdoms. So the monks are important in that sense. And then they also offer this vision of this kind of Christianity in a monastery. They're doing Christianity in the most extreme forms usually. Poverty, they're not marrying, but they're kind of singing and praising God all day in these communities where it's supposed to be like a taste of heavenly life, right? Freed from earthly burdens. And then you have kings and often queens. Often it's powerful females married to these men, and conversions of entire kingdoms. If the king or the queen converts, sometimes the entire kingdom can convert. And then we move on to the next book, Andrew Wall's The Missionary Movement. This is question 6. The author moves through basically 5 stages of Christianity. Christianity in the earliest centuries, in the 1st century, Christianity in Nicaea in the 4th century, Christianity in Ireland in the 9th century, Christianity in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain in the 19th century, and then Christianity in Nigeria today. And he points out that there's differences in all of these. And again, I want you to flesh out most of these, but we can see that the Christianity in the 1st century, for instance, is very Jewish. It's heavily Jewish. In Nicaea, it's Greek. The language is Greek, and the philosophy and the ideas are Greek. Their interests are Greek. By the time we get to the Irish in the 9th century, this kind of Northern European Christianity, we see it's heavily interested in penance. It's interested in practices, certain practices that may seem harsh by our standards today. By the 19th century, you have people using business, technology to think about Christianity in a very different way, focusing on its spread, like some of the others, but with very new ideas about how to spread it. And then in Nigeria today, you have an emphasis on spiritual power. And these are not strange cases, as Walls points out. You could argue that each of these represents the heart of the faith at the time, the center of gravity, where the most Christian conversions are happening, where the most Christians actually live, and what they're actually doing. And so you just see there's these kind of wild changes through Christian history. And yet they all call themselves Christians. So what are similar, right? In group question 7, I ask, what is similar about all these Christians? And what's different? What's different, I can let you spell out what's similar. Also, Walls talks about, but I think just to give you some ideas, for one thing, they see themselves as connected. Certain rituals they have, certain beliefs they have are also very similar. And then what is the indigenizing principle? This is a principle that basically one of the key questions in this class is, what is the relationship of the Christian message to human culture? This is something you may not have thought about too much, but the idea for Christians in history is that God became a human being, which is Jesus. And this is kind of a contradiction in itself. God is supposed to exist outside the world, outside the universe, above and beyond the universe, beyond human understanding. How can God possibly become a human being? And in this kind of contradiction are these 2 principles we're going to talk about, right? So the indigenizing principle is the becoming human part, right? Is the part that's very familiar at home. It makes it indigenous. It makes American Christianity seem American, Mexican Christianity seem Mexican. It gives it that kind of national, local flavor. And so this is the part that's going to say, well, these are the right things. These are the things about our indigenous culture, our home culture, that were right. They were true, they were good, they were beautiful, even before Christ. And now that we are Christian, it just affirms it. It just says, yep, you were doing it right all along. So then the next question, 8, what is the Pilgrim Principle? This is the opposite one. This is the one that emphasizes God, or far above, being removed from human concerns, having God's a God's eye view of things. And this is the one that critiques it then. This is the one that you have radicals and revolutionaries, people who live apart from culture in every culture, right? You have American Christians who critique mainstream American culture, who don't want to go along with, let's say, American politics and society and culture, who want to condemn it, maybe, or just separate themselves from it. And the same in Mexico, and the same in Korea. You have people countercultural, looking at their own cultures and saying, these are the things that are wrong. These are the things that are evil, that are ugly, that are false about our old culture. This is the Pilgrim Principle. And it means pilgrim because pilgrim is a traveler, a wanderer. The idea is that you're far away, you're wandering on the earth. The whole earth is not your home. And this is the stance that many Christians take to critique their own cultures. And so the general principles, I would like you to, again, to flesh these out, but part of it is de-emphasizing the Western and the European. That's clearly part of it. And another part, the other side of that, is emphasizing the local, what's going on. And then there's a couple more points Walls makes about seriousness, about the scripture, that again I want you to think about. And then the last question is, what are some of the specific battles that African Christians are concerned with? How do these correspond with Christian history, people like Clement and Justin, and then how do they correspond to the indigenizing and pilgrim principles? So one of the most significant questions that these African theologians and thinkers and Christians are facing is what to do about their past. The African past, many of them are converting they're the first generation or second or third generation to convert from African indigenous traditions, African religions. And so the question is, again, how much can they accept? How do they have to reject? So you have Africans arguing, well, our religion was never really polytheistic. We never worshiped many gods. We worshiped one God with many manifestations. And so now that we're Christians, we can see the same things, right? We can see God being manifested in many ways, being manifested in creation, or being manifested in saints, or in Christian holy people in the past or in the present. So there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with our old religion. There's not much wrong. And then you have other people who critique that, who say those weren't our beliefs at all, or we need to reject our past completely. We should not we shouldn't revere or respect our ancestors. And these are actually a lot of the same questions that the earliest Christians asked themselves in the first centuries when they first started converting. Again, within the first few generations, Christians started wondering, well, what about, because of where they were at? They were in the Roman Empire with its kind of Greek history and Greco-Roman traditions and ways of thought. They said, well, what do we do about philosophy? What do we do about our ancestors? And so you had Christians making similar arguments, saying, well, philosophers were like Christians before Christ. And they showed us the way before Christ was here to help give a little bit of light. Or they were like a school bus driver or someone taking you to school. They were away. The goal was Christ. Christ is at the school, but the philosophers were a driver to get you there, someone to make sure the children get to where they're supposed to be going. And so you have these kind of arguments. And so you have both indigenizing and pilgrim arguments then. So you have people who want to get rid of the resurrection because it's such a strange idea for Greeks. That would be an indigenous argument. For a Greek in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the body is not a great thing. You want to be free of the body. So you have Christians adapting the message in that way, saying, well, the Christian message is actually one that talks about how to be free from your body, how to access a higher truth. And then you have pilgrim ideas who criticize all of Greek philosophy and ideas entirely. They don't like these ideas that the philosophers were Christians before Christ. They say, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? What does Christ have to do with philosophy? Nothing is their answer. They don't like the temples, they don't like the worship, they don't like the philosophy, they don't like anything. So you have these kind of battles baked into Christianity from the beginning. So in a way, what we see these days in the 21st century is no different from what we already take for granted, from the Christianity that many people take for granted. There's always this struggle over culture within culture. So those are the 9 questions I hope we can talk about them more in class.